After working on my Space Marine kill team, I really got the bug for converting a small unit of individual characters, and so I was eager to expand this out into more factions. The first of these were a faction that has often been requested, but is something that I had never covered on the channel. Until now, that is. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to kitbash a Grey Knight kill team. I'll be giving this guide 4 dead animal bits out of 5. There are quite a few parts needed from other kits, a fair amount of cutting and trimming, and also some sculpting required. With the release of Primaris, the original Grey Knight models are looking a little small, so I was reluctant to use them as they were. I wanted something that was a little bulkier, but it needed to retain the general ornateness of the Grey Knights, as well as some of their signature aesthetics. So I turned to the Primaris Blade Guard, at least for some of my parts. Now before I go on, I just want to give a big thank you to Firestorm Games, who helped me out with some of the parts that I needed for this video. Check out the description for a link to their site where you can pick up some discounted Games Workshop products. So from this kit, I clipped away and cleaned up some of the parts required to build the legs and torso of just a single Blade Guard for now. The Blade Guard torso was much chunkier in its size, which would be great for my slightly upscale Grey Knights. But in itself, it lacked that iconic Grey Knight styling. I needed something from an actual Grey Knight kit, but the regular power armor torsos from the Strike Squad wouldn't be big enough. So I turned to the much chunkier Grey Knight Paladins, whose Terminator armor was much better proportioned against the new legs, and had all the Grey Knight iconography and detailing that I wanted. It also had the all-important Psychic Hood, something that is important for amplifying the Grey Knight's Psyker abilities. Attaching these two components together would be tricky though, and would require the entire removal of the Blade Guard's upper torso, which is why I decided to build just the one team member for the time being. I wanted to make sure that this would actually work before I ruined a whole squad of Blade Guard. I began the removal by making a diagonal cut along each side of the chest armor, leaving the stomach area attached to the legs. These two inwardly sloping cuts were then joined by a horizontal cut, which freed the upper torso from the midriff and the legs. This same cutting technique was then repeated on the rear half of the torso, so I was just left with the lower back attached to the legs. Now that the Blade Guard upper torso had been removed, I had a much better idea of how I would go about attaching the assembled Grey Knight Paladin torso. The Paladin torso already had a rounded socket, so it made the most sense for me to round out at the top of the Blade Guard legs so that it fit inside of it. After dry fitting the parts together, I could see that the small remnants of armor around the stomach and lower back needed to be cut back. During this process, I made several comparisons against the torso to ensure that the cuts that I was making were being done in the correct locations and in the correct amounts. As each of the torsos and legs are slightly different, it's difficult to give an exact idea of what cuts should be made here. For example, with these particular legs, a small pouch at the back of the waist was getting in the way, so it needed to be removed. Once it had been cut away and smooth, the torso fit a lot better. It did leave a small hole behind in the plastic, but this would be covered over later, and so wasn't a problem. Additional cuts were also needed to the legs. I wouldn't be attaching the regular bolt pistol holster, so some of the protruding tabs could be removed too. These were smoothed flat and checked by dry fitting the two halves and the legs together. With all of the adjustments to the torso and legs made, I began by separately assembling the legs and torso before gluing them together, resulting in the basis for my Grey Knight. My first team member was Alaric, who I armed with a demon hammer in order to take full advantage of that extra attack generated by his combat specialism. For this, I needed an arm that would fit the scale of the new legs and torso. I chose an Assault Intercessor pistol arm and the demon hammer components from the Grey Knight Terminator kit. I chose this one specifically because it was held in a single hand, rather than the two-handed option from the regular Strike Squad kit. The Primaris arm was also holding something in its hand though, so this needed to be cut away at the wrist first. Once removed, I then cut away any remaining parts of the hand and flattened out the wrist. Again, it's best practice here to make frequent comparisons against the parts to ensure that they will fit properly. I then glued the arm to the torso and then glued the hand to the arm. For the left arm, I used another one of the Assault Intercessors and grabbed myself a Strike Squad arm with a mounted Stormbolter as well. As Grey Knight Stormbolters are attached at the wrist, I would also need a left hand too, so I opted to attach the severed head carrying hand from the Terminator set. Like before, I removed the hand from the arm and then trimmed things back a little until I was happy with how the hand was fitting against the wrist. But I didn't glue anything just yet. Because first, I needed to work on the Stormbolter. I first clipped away the forearm mounted weapon from the Grey Knight's arm and then shaved away any remaining bits. Following this, I then found that the concave nature of the vambrace would make attaching the weapon tricky, so the two raised points at either end were flattened out before gluing everything together, completing the main structure of the model. Now at this stage in the build, I had a mini dilemma. I'd actually changed my mind about the torso. I found that the lack of a power pack resulted in the armor looking too much like Terminator armor rather than just a bulkier take on regular power armor. The problem was I now had to remove the vents from the back of the torso in order to make room for the pack, something that would have been much easier to do earlier on in the build. So I set about making the changes, starting out with my clippers to remove the bulk of the plastic and then shade everything smooth with a knife until I was able to glue a Grey Knight power pack into place. This was then followed by the head and shoulder pads, all of which were taken from the Grey Knight Strike Squad kit. The Blade Guard scabbard was the next thing to tackle. Due to the new torso, the regular components wouldn't fit, so a little clipping and bending was required for it to sit properly. I then finished it off by attaching the sword's hilt. The small hole at the back of the model was then patched up with a pouch before gluing on a tilt shield found in the Grey Knight Terminator's kit. At this point, the model was pretty much completed, but I still had a little detail to add. In a lot of the Space Marine and Grey Knight artwork, the models are practically covered in purity seals and parchment, and this is something that I wanted to recreate. I cut out and mixed a small amount of green stuff and rolled it out into a thin sausage. I then grabbed some foil and lightly coated it with Vaseline, creating a smooth, pliable surface to work on. The green stuff was added to the foil and I then rolled the sausage flat. Because I had only greased the foil, the flattened green stuff was now stuck to the roller. While the green stuff was here, I then added a small series of nicks and tears to the edges to create that disheveled look. Once I was done, I gave the green stuff an hour or so to firm up a little. Now that the putty wasn't as soft, I could carefully peel it away from the roller before supergluing it to the hammer. As the green stuff was still slightly malleable, I could wrap it around the handle, completing the look. This process was then repeated a few times, first at the front of the Grey Knight's tabard and then around the scabbard. To finish these off, I then glued some purity seals to the tops of them. Remember to use superglue here though, because plastic glue won't work. And with that, the first task model was done, and I could move on to working on the remaining 4 team members. For these, I decided to batch the torsos and legs together in a single step, which would form the basis of each model. I began by removing the Blade Guard and Grey Knight Terminator torsos from their sprues, before cutting away the Blade Guard torsos and Grey Knight vents and gluing everything together, leaving me with the bodies that I'll be using for the next 4 fighters. The second squad member to build was the Zealot, Leonatos. To benefit from that extra attack and strength on the charge, I decided to arm him with a pair of falchions, giving him another bonus attack as well as some decent AP and damage. Like with Alaric, I began with a pair of the Primus arms, specifically those sword-carrying Blade Guard arms, and 2 falchion hands from the Grey Knight Strike Squad set. For both of these arms, I removed the hands and trimmed things back to create a flat joint, just like I did before. However, in addition to this, I also shaved away the Indomitus symbol from the right arm. The vambrace of the left arm was also flattened out to make room for a Stormbolter, which again was removed from the Grey Knight Strike Squad kit. With the arms, hands and bolter prepped, they were all glued together and attached to the torso. As I'd used Blade Guard arms here, my regular Strike Squad shoulder pads wouldn't be big enough to fit over the enlarged shoulders. Fortunately, the Grey Knight Terminator pads work perfectly here, so a couple of these were attached as well as a power pack. I then selected a helmetless head from the Strike Squad set, which featured a suitably zealous looking expression, and glued this into place. Following this, I attached a scabbard. Again, modifications were required to get this to fit properly against that new torso. The Grey Knights already have a zealous devotion to their task, so enhancing this on a model was a little tricky. Ultimately, I chose to tackle this with the addition of lots of purity seals and a very large tome. This particular piece was sourced from one of the Terminator banner poles. I clipped away the knife that doubled as a stand. With a little trimming, I now had a book that could be glued to the Grey Knight's waist. This was followed up with another pouch to the back, again to cover up any damage, and another tilt shield was also added. Finally, using that same green stuff method that I'd used around the Demon Hammer, I created a wrap of parchment around Leonatos' wrist, followed by another purity seal, superglued to the green stuff wrap. The next specialist was Calidus, the demolition specialist armed with an incinerator. Getting this immolating weapon into the hand of a slightly larger scaled arm was solved with a Hellblaster plasma gun. To join these two parts together, I began by sawing away the rear part of the plasma gun along with the rail that runs across the top. This left me with the arm, grip, the receiver, and the rail. I continued by sawing away the rear part of the incinerator, trimming the cut afterwards to ensure that I had a good flat surface. With this done, the Hellblaster arm was then glued to the remnants of the incinerator before everything was glued to one of the pre-prepared torsos. Matching up a left hand to be holding the incinerator would have been a little tricky, so I ultimately decided to cheat and go for a pointing hand, matching the load position of the weapon. The arm was taken from the Assault Intercessor's kit in order to match the sizings of the right arm. The hand was then removed before being replaced with a pointing hand from the Strike Squad. This completed arm was then glued to the body, followed by some regular power armor shoulder pads, and finally the power pack. To emphasize the demolition specialism of this model, I began with a servo skull taken from the Terminator kit. When paired up with a pointing arm, this gave the appearance that Calidus was ordering the skull to assess a particular target or scout a certain area. This was glued to the left side of the torso, taking advantage of as many contact points as possible to ensure a strong fit. In a similar vein to the servo skull, I grabbed myself the Terminator Apothecary rack and clipped away one of the sensors. With a little trimming, this was then glued into place just behind Calidus' right shoulder and was angled to face in the pointing direction. Combined with the servo skull, these helped to sell the model's additional range specialisms. With these in place, all that was left to do was to attach the sword sheath, a Grey Knight head facing to the left to match the flow of the model, and finally a scattering of purity seals. As I was building a 5-man team and the rules only allowed for 4 specialists, Macaroth would fill in as the regular Grey Knight. Again, a pair of falchions were chosen for this loadout, and I followed the same hand swap steps that I had adopted for Leonatos. Another Stormbolter was relinquished and attached to the Blade Guard arm before they were attached to the torso. 2 more Terminator shoulder pads were then used before attaching the power pack. Finally, a Grey Knight head was used and extra items of equipment were glued about Macaroth's belt. This just left me with one more model to tackle, which was of course Isaiah, the leader of the Grey Knight kill team. So far, I hadn't really indicated the Grey Knight's psycho abilities, but this seemed like a great way to single out the squad's leader. I had this idea to create the appearance of levitating rocks lifting up from the base, and so to match this, I wanted the left arm to be raised. This would be achieved with a chainsword carrying Assault Intercessor arm and a hand from the Strike Squad. I clipped away the chainsword carrying hand from the arm and cut back the remnants to leave me with a flat wrist joint. This was followed by some small trims to the new hand to help ensure the position would look natural. The hand was then glued to the wrist, and then the arm was attached to the final torso. However, I had a problem with the shoulder size. As I had planned to use a Blade Guard right arm, this left arm shoulder profile would look unbalanced against it. Fortunately, the Blade Guard kit comes with a few of these shoulder pad inners that, when glued to the left shoulder, sufficiently bulked up to the desired size. This left arm was then finished off with its Stormbolter, which left me with this psychic ability wielding appearance. For the right arm, I employed the usual Blade Guard arm and, you guessed it, falchion combination. paying particular attention once more to remove that Indomitus symbol. Once done, everything was glued together, quickly followed by some slightly more ornate Terminator pads and the power pack. To help further emphasize Isaiah's rank, I attached another book to the waist along with some of the more slightly ornate looking purity seals. All there was left to do then was to pick a head. I chose a bare Terminator head for this task. I found that its grimaced face and cable-bedecked coif were the perfect complement to the psychic power that he was channeling. This was glued into place, completing the model and the team. All that was needed to be done was to base and paint, which left me with this. And here we have the completed 5-man Grey Knight kill team: Alaric, Leonatos, Calidus, Macaroth, and Isaiah. Compared to my Raptors kill team, getting these specialisms converted and onto the miniatures were a little trickier, but I'm happy with the results, and I think I've managed to keep things on theme for the Grey Knights. The rescaling here was also a bit of a gamble. I wasn't sure if the Blade Guard legs would look odd against the Grey Knight detailing, or if they'd look too big. But these guys are still shorter than a Primaris, while still being a little better proportioned, so I'm staying true to the lore here. I was also worried about them looking too much like Terminators, but I think with the 32mm base size and the power packs, that helps to offset the use of the chunkier Terminator torsos and the shoulders. Now, if you enjoyed this video and would like to see me tackle more kill teams, be sure to leave me a like and your suggestions for other factions you would like to see me tackle. I'll also be putting together a basing guide for these Demon World bases very soon as well. Finally, a big thank you once again to Firestorm Games for helping me out with a few of the kits that I used in this video. Check out the description for a link to their site where you can pick up some discounted Games Workshop products and try this kitbash for yourself. And also a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently my top supporters on Patreon are Gesteigpanzer, Jonathan Hart, Stuart Smith, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Raphael Beiruthi, Nice OJ, and Sweatsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you choose my affiliates links, then your help is what allows me to fund the equipment and materials required to make these guides. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.